Hello, welcome. Thanks for being here. We have people coming into the webinar. We will get started in just a moment, but we want to thank you for being here. All right, at this time, we are going to go ahead and get started. Hello, and thank you for joining us for Seeing the Elephant, Understanding Evidence for Literacy. My name is Christina Grayson, and on behalf of my co-presenter and our colleagues at the Region 1 Comprehensive Center, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this 90-minute session. At this time, we are starting with recording and live captioning of this session, and you can access the captions by clicking the CC button at the bottom, and those will be running throughout the session. Our topic today is evidence-based literacy practices in the science of reading, which from legislation to curricular materials continues to spark conversation about effective equitable instruction. And during this webinar, we'll examine what's necessary for productive discussion of the science of reading and writing and evidence for literacy. And we'll think about the science of teaching, implementation science, methodology considerations, and by differentiating between evidence and research and claims about research, we'll explore productive ways to analyze and discuss evidence as one piece of a puzzle in decision making. The webinar will conclude with a demonstration of a tool to use ESSA non-regulatory guidance with a framework to inform decisions based on context. And throughout this session, we'll be using several resources from federal agencies, systemic improvement organizations, and technical assistance centers. Those links to resources will be in the chat, so you can follow along in real time. And after the webinar, all the resources will be shared as well as a recording of this webinar. And while this is in webinar format, we encourage your full engagement. So as we go through, feel free and encouraged to jot questions and ask them in the chat or using the Q&A feature. We'll discuss those in the last 5 to 10 minutes of our time together. This webinar is hosted by the Region 1 Comprehensive Center and was developed in collaboration with the Region 9 Comprehensive Center, both of which are two of those technical assistance centers I mentioned previously. The Region 1 Comprehensive Center currently serves Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont, and it's one of 19 regional centers that is working across the country. There they are. The Region 1 Comprehensive Center is one of the centers that works and is funded by the U.S. Department of Education, and each comprehensive center works with regional, state, and local education agencies to provide intensive capacity building services, addressing authentic needs. And the comprehensive centers work with states and school districts to select, implement, scale, and sustain evidence-based practices supporting teacher practice and student outcomes. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Christina Grayson, and I work with the Region 1 Comprehensive Center as well as with the regional educational laboratories in the Midwest and Southwest. And in my work, I develop materials and support quality implementation of projects advancing equity and language and literacy development, culturally and linguistically sustaining practices in intervention and in database decision making. And prior to working with the Region 1 Comprehensive Center, operated by American Institutes for Research, or AIR, I worked at the district level as an assistant director and then director supporting early literacy instructional strategy. Prior to that, I was a reading interventionist in inclusion settings, and I started my career as a first grade teacher. I'm joined today by my colleague at Region 1, Corey Stye, and I'll hand it over to Corey to introduce himself and orient us to our webinar a bit more. Corey?
Thanks, Christina. Hello, everyone. I am thrilled to be joining Christina today and all of you to spend some quality time considering the evidence and its use for guiding decisions about literacy policy, programs, and practice. In my day-to-day, I lead several literacy projects working with several state education agency partners for both Region 1 and Region 9, as Christina mentioned. Previously, I served 15 years as an ELA educator and reading interventionist, and taught a literacy course as an adjunct instructor for pre-service educators. I also served for 5 years in a state education agency in the Midwest as a state reading specialist, and we are thrilled to be presenting this webinar to you today. So let's take a look at our goals for today's webinar. What brings us here together and binds us together in this work is a desire to ensure all students can gain literacy proficiency and that each student gets access to what they need and the right opportunities and support to achieve that proficiency. In a time where we have all witnessed or perhaps experienced ourselves not only passionate, but at times contentious and unproductive discussions about the needs of students and the best practices for nurturing and building them up as proficient readers and writers, which some have dubbed the second great reading war. We conceive this webinar as an opportunity to build bridges that might enable positive and productive evidence-based conversations. To do so, we hope to promote responsible and informed use of some important concepts to properly situate and apply research evidence to advance effective implementation. To those ends, here are our objectives for today's webinar. At the end of this time together, we hope you will be able to define and distinguish among a variety of different research tracks within the sciences that inform literacy policy and practice. In doing so, we will unpack what it takes to derive strong evidence, as well as the important distinctions among evidence, research, and claims about research. Through understanding of the criteria and methods for generating evidence, then you will each be able to apply those distinctions to elevate our discussions and speak productively about common research claims. Finally, today you will receive a couple of resources to support your learning of a process to identify and select evidence-based programs, practices, or interventions informed by your local context. Specifically, you will learn a decision-making process that determines the ESSA tier of evidence for a program, practice, or intervention as required by some federal programs. Finally, evidence is just one piece of a puzzle, right? We'll close by grounding today's discussion within a wider set of considerations that apply when identifying evidence-based policies and practices. So, with all of that, let's set the stage with a familiar parable, which we will use to frame today's talk, the parable of the blind men and the elephant. As the story goes, there once were 6 blind men who lived in the same village in India. Each one had been blind since birth, and none had ever experienced an elephant. Having heard stories of them from travelers, they each imagined what an elephant might be like. One day, as the men stood by the side of the road, someone came up the road driving an elephant. When they learned of the great beast, the men implored the traveler to let them touch the elephant. The first man put his hand on its side and understood an elephant is just like a wall. The second man held its tusk, so round and sharp, and corrected, no, an elephant is like a spear. The third man happened to take hold of the elephant's trunk. Well, you are both wrong. It is obvious that an elephant is like a snake. The fourth man, upon reaching out, grabbed one of the elephant's great legs. Oh, you all really are blind. It is plain to me that an elephant is tall like a tree. The fifth man, who had encountered the elephant's great ear, determined resolutely that the elephant was wide and flat and just like a fan. Finally, the sixth blind man, who had approached from the rear, had a hold of the elephant's swinging tail and resolutely discovered that the elephant was very much like a rope. So these men argued the rest of the day about the elephant, about which each was partly right, but each of whom had it wrong. They debate to this day about the elephant that none of them has seen. This parable and folktale, told and retold in dozens of great versions, we think is an appropriate metaphor for the current debates over the science of reading. For in some renderings of the fable, the men come to believe the others are being dishonest and come to blows. The current debates have sometimes felt a little bit like this. So as we enter today's exploration, I'd like to set a few assumptions that Christina and I have and hope that you'll adopt as well today and in future conversations. First, we believe all interested parties within this debate share a passion and desire to support learners and ensure their health and happiness, including as derived from a strong proficiency in literacy, which provides so many opportunities in modern society. Second, we assume positive intent. We engaged in a brainstorm of this webinar after experiencing conversations that seemed to lack that fundamental assumption of positive intent from everyone there. We are aligned in wanting to do our best for kids, right? So finally, one of the things I value most about the great people with whom I get to work, like Christina, is that we approach this work with the belief that none of us know it all, that we each bring knowledge, experience, and perspectives that expand our understanding. The flip side of that coin is that without that assumption, we run the danger of holding and arguing perspectives based on limited information, like the blind men and the elephant, focusing on one part of the evidence. So to ensure we're not talking about the rope and claiming it's a spear, or worse yet, failing to understand the elephant at all, we're going to take time today to see the elephant that is evidence to support literacy. As we move through our content today, I encourage you to think openly and critically about how this content connects to conversations you've had or experienced, what new ideas or understanding extend your thinking in new directions, and what challenge you can set for your own contributions to productive discourse for literacy grounded in evidence. Before I tag Christina back in, I want to preview that over the course of her presentation on the sciences that inform literacy policy and practices, you'll be invited to share your thinking. We've set up a Padlet to do so. We believe this is an easier space to share and experience each other's thinking than the scroll of death that's a chat window. So I invite you now to snap the QR code or use the link being provided in the chat to open that Padlet. If you're so moved during the course of the presentation, you're welcome to share thoughts as we go as well. And with that, Christina, I invite you to please show us the elephant.
Thanks, Corey. So let's go ahead and dig into these sciences or the topical areas that we're going to think about today that inform literacy policy and practice. And in doing so, we're going to distinguish between reading versus literacy, think about the neuroscience of reading and writing, teaching science, the science of research, otherwise known as methodology, and implementation science. So as we get started, to start off, let's ground ourselves in a definition we can use for the purposes of today's webinar. This definition offered by the Reading League is one of several out there. And the Reading League defines the science of reading as a vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about reading and issues related to reading and writing. And that research includes and uses communications from communication sciences, cognitive sciences, neuroscience, linguistics, and more. And what's particularly of note for our conversation today is that in February 2021, Dr. Maria Murray, who's the founder and CEO of the Reading League, commented on this definition saying this: "For years now, the science of reading phrase has been used without a strong foundational understanding of its meaning. And now that we see the phrase being attached to efforts that are not evidence aligned, and as more people start to join our movement, the Reading League has created a plan to protect and honor the body of knowledge considered the science of reading, clarify that definition, and provide a comprehensive guide to stakeholders." So generally speaking, the science of reading generates evidence that can inform practice. Much of the sometimes contentious debate that Corey mentioned uses assumptions on what the process of learning to read should be and how instruction should look based on how we define reading and literacy. When we consider what will move towards more productive discourse, you might ask yourself, what are your operating definitions? And if who you're talking to defines reading and literacy the same way or differently, knowing that there is overlap between the two. Often those two words are used interchangeably, and depending on who is using them and when, they can each take a definition that's wide and broad, like the tree on the left, or a definition that's narrow and specific, like the trees on the right. The result can be that each side says that the other is missing the forest for the trees. And in talking about what they called, quote unquote, a sociocultural chasm in the science of reading, the literacy expert experts Robert Tierney and David Pearson point out that researchers are often tasked to define their terms, and they do so in various ways. For example, when writing about how psychological science informs the teaching of reading, Keith Rayner, who's a cognitive psychologist, and some colleagues defined learning to read as the acquisition of knowledge that results in the child being able to define and understand printed words he or she knows on the basis of spoken language. And they distinguish this from learning to be literate, calling learning to be literate the sum of a variety of educational outcomes or dispositions towards learning, interests in reading and writing, knowledge of subject matter domains, all of which go beyond reading. Cultural practices also inform our development of approaches to and uses of research and evidence. Consider, for example, tribal nation education ways of knowing that are different and important for equitable, effective work in tribal nations. And as such, curiosity and dialogue should arise out of discussions of the generalizability of education research, recognizing variability in the particulars. The setting, that's the total context in which teaching and learning occurs, is the starting point. This begs that we keep in mind our underlying assumptions in our approach to this work. And when engaging in dialogue with others, be curious about their underlying assumptions. When we discuss these things, we must be clear about what we're talking about, how we are defining those things in conversations, considering what works, in what setting, and for whom. And then coming back to that idea of reading and literacy sometimes being used interchangeably, separating them can help focus our conversations and avoid conflating the what and the why with the how. With that in mind, let's transition to look at 4 topical areas that are currently underpinning literacy policy and influencing practice: that neuroscience of reading and writing, the science of teaching, the science of research, and also known as methodology, and implementation science. And we want to acknowledge that these are not formal branches of science, but rather useful areas of research helpful to our understanding our elephant today. We'll start with the neuroscience of reading and writing, which tells us what's happening in the neurotypical brain when it becomes wired for print in relation to our existing capacity for oral language. Mark Seidenberg, Marianne Wolf, David Kilpatrick, and Stanislav Duhan are some of the researchers who have written about this process, talking about several regions of the brain that come together and in some cases undergo some remodeling and rewiring to develop the networks necessary for reading print. These networks are the human brain's capacity for pronunciation and articulation of sounds, capacity for meaning making, and parts of the brain that coordinate visual inputs like symbol and object recognition and control directional attention like looking from left to right, top to bottom in some printed systems, right to left, top to bottom, bottom to top in others. When we talk about the neuroscience of reading and writing, here are some of the questions that we might consider. How does the brain develop over time for reading? How does a neurotypical brain work when someone reads? Those relationships and processes. In what ways can the brain's reading network become impaired or be different for neurodiverse readers? How does the brain process information when someone who knows multiple languages reads? How does the act of writing affect brain development? What are the underlying causes of writing disability? And the neuroscience of reading and writing is separate and distinct from the science of teaching, which asks what programs and practices are effective in teaching reading. For whom are they effective? What is the relative efficiency of different programs or practices generally or for specific student groups like multilingual learners, students with disabilities, the difference by race and ethnicity? What methods and data are effective ways to assess reading? How can educators best use data for decision making? What are effective ways to teach children or pedagogy? And how is this different from effective ways to teach adults how to use practices or programs with fidelity? With these questions in mind, we can see the Reading League's definition of the science of reading speaking to both the neuroscience and the science of teaching as it refers to that vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about issues related to reading and writing. The neuroscience of reading and the science of teaching are different than the science of research or methodology, which considers these items that are on the screen now. Which research approaches are valid for studying the science of reading and the science of teaching, and how can they be improved? Which data analysis methods are valid, and to what level of confidence? How can those be improved? What sample sizes yield the results that can reasonably be generalized or considered likely to be true? Or what conditions invalidate or call into question a study's findings? And we can think about methodology as connected to quality. When we consider research, methodology, and evidence, we can also think about an umbrella. Consider an umbrella that has holes in it versus one that doesn't. If your goal is to stay completely dry when there's some sort of precipitation, an umbrella with holes on it might do an okay job with that or not, depending on the type of precipitation. If it's pouring rain versus drizzle, hail, or snow. It depends on what kind of participation is happening that an umbrella might serve to keep you dry. Like an umbrella with holes in it, a research study without strong methodology is still a research study, but it doesn't provide consistent evidence that it will reliably and consistently do the job if the job of the umbrella is to keep you completely dry. And there are different types of studies that yield different levels of evidence. When we talk about evidence that's currently informing policy and practice, we're often talking about what's being generated using experimental frameworks. And this is not to say that findings from studies using a non-experimental framework should be discounted or disregarded. Studies using naturalistic frameworks produce valuable findings and extend ways of knowing. Think back to our earlier conversation about research and evidence that are being grounded in culture. But distinguishing between types of frameworks that help us get clear about who we are talking about, when, and for whom, and for what purpose towards a certain outcome, depend on how that study is designed. When we ask about the science of reading, a neuroscience of reading and writing, the science of teaching, and the methodology, it doesn't tell us exactly what you as educators, coaches, district and state leaders are tasked with carrying out, which is implementation science. That includes which methods and strategies facilitate the use of an evidence-based practice, which barriers hinder the uptake of desired practices by practitioners, which professional learning or supports improve fidelity to desired behaviors. How does implementation differ in varying contexts, such as dual immersion, bilingual or monolingual classrooms, primary, intermediate, secondary settings? All of those things are the things that we have to be thinking about as we pull together the neuroscience of reading and writing, the science of teaching, and think about methodology. So we've talked about the neuroscience of reading and writing, that science of teaching, that science of research, implementation science is 4 of the sciences that are influencing literacy policy and practice. And here they are together. A link to this reference is going to be in the chat, and it shows all 4 quadrants and their questions on one resource. And you might be thinking about how there's an interplay between these quadrants. It's worthwhile, however, to consider them separately, especially as we think back to our earlier points about the evidence behind each of these sciences being generated by different people, different researchers in different departments and different disciplines who are not necessarily talking to each other or thinking about how that evidence will come together in practice. That's up to us. It's up to us to think about how do we put them together. And you can see at the center of the infographic is really circling in on that policy and practice piece, which helps us to think about the fact that sometimes the evidence doesn't line up with the policy. Sometimes policymakers cherry pick their evidence, and the research to policy to practice gap often goes in multiple directions. So here we'll invite you to pause and consider, what does this mean for how we think about the elephant? What do these questions illuminate separately or together? Have you experienced a time when someone was talking about science as evidence for a different set of questions? You might be thinking about conversations that you've had or heard, perhaps people who couldn't reach consensus because we weren't actually talking about the same thing. When you talk with others, ask yourself, which one of these things are you talking about? Are the people that are in the conversation with you all talking about the same thing? For our conversations and our actions to be effective, we can't take one as the other and overlook the nuance that really matters. So with that in mind, let's apply these distinctions to elevate productive discussion about common claims about research. When talking about teaching children how to read, something you might hear a lot of when it comes to teaching reading is this: it's settled science. If we know to differentiate, though, between the neuroscience of reading and writing and the science of teaching, however, we can ask a question that might advance that conversation productively, like this one. Which science are you talking about? This is important because findings from research about questions in one area do not indicate findings in research to questions in another. The neuroscience of reading is more settled than the science of teaching, which is less settled. Here's another claim you might have heard before. The science of reading in practice is giving all kids the same thing at the same time, including things they don't need. If we stop to probe what's meant here, though, we can consider how we are making decisions about practices and which ones to bring into classrooms and how to do those practices well and how to make sure that they work well together. To be effective, we have to distinguish between the science of teaching and implementation science. We need to consider the science of teaching students versus the science of teaching adults, changing behavior, and supporting strong implementation. How about this one? You can find evidence to support anything. Methodology, or the science of research, and implementation science help us rethink that claim or statement. Let's consider practices in terms of implementation versus methodology. If within methodology, we know that there are different types of research and that those types of research generate various levels of evidence, we can productively talk about whether something is worth doing or not. And as always, we are going to consider context. Implementation science then helps us think about evidence in a different way. We can talk about a practice when it's done versus when it's done well. We can ask, are we arguing against a practice, or are we arguing against a practice implemented poorly? Consider also that some practices will never have an evidence base or evidence at the highest level through experimental design. An example of that is repeated reading. What Works Clearinghouse assigns an evidence rating of no evidence. However, no one advocates that this practice by itself is sufficient or even appropriate for developing reading fluency. Through an experimental design, treatment at all would have to be withheld from a control group, meaning that they would receive no instruction at all, and such isolation would be unethical. And yet, 4 meta-analyses with more than 200 studies revealed overwhelmingly positive outcomes using this practice. This example shows that some things worth doing can't be studied to yield the strongest possible evidence level due to ethical issues or challenges isolating the topic of study. Other common barriers include the availability of funding or simply the nature of the item being studied. Corey will dig more into this later, but here's an overview of those ESSA tiers of evidence, 4 of which, and then they count as showing what counts as an evidence-based practices as yielded through an experimental design framework. We also know that there are many components that go into proficient reading, and there's no shortage of frameworks to help us talk about this, such as Scarborough's Reading Rope, Guff and Tumner's Simple View of Reading, Nell Duke and her colleagues have the Active View of Reading, just to name a few. And with that in mind, consider that so much of what comprises skilled reading and comprehension proficiency cannot be studied to that highest level of evidence rating. That doesn't mean that it's not good for kids or it doesn't matter for their overall learning development or development as a literate human being. The reading framework for the 2026 National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, defines reading comprehension as this: making meaning with text, a complex process shaped by many factors, including readers' abilities to, 1, engage with text in print and multimodal forms, 2, employ personal resources that include foundational reading skills, language, knowledge, and motivation. And 3, extract, construct, and integrate, critique, apply meaning in activities across a range of social and cultural contexts. To get at this goal, reading comprehension, a variety of both evidence and research-based practices are needed, considered through the lens of specific cultural context. So putting that all together, what does this mean for how we might talk with others about evidence and using evidence? Think about a meeting where someone said something that shut down the conversation and maybe turned people off to what needed to be discussed. Everyone walked away angry or drained, and perhaps it sounded something like this. or this, or this, or even this one. We need to be careful about how we use language in service of our goals. And when you hear these kinds of conversation stoppers, it might be an indication of need for clarity through specificity and considering more than one science when discussing evidence. And even though those sciences have differing perspectives and nuances, and there's no single story and there's no magic bullet, it doesn't need to be an us versus them scenario. Responding genuinely and with curiosity using specific scientific questions or science-specific questions takes the personal out of it. And that helps us further the conversation, further discussion, and increase our capacity for effective decision-making. Corey asked us as we got started to consider throughout this section how the content resonates with you and connects with your experiences and the conversations you're having, how this content might extend your thinking about the discourse invoking the science of reading, and to challenge yourselves to grow in new directions or make new commitments to using this content. Here's that Padlet one more time, and the link will be in the chat. There's a QR code if you prefer. And Padlet is a collaborative posting platform. Using that link in the chat or the QR code, you can find those 3 questions on that Padlet. Choose the one that resonates most with you right now, and you can use the plus button here or here to share your thoughts. We have so far distinguished between evidence, research, claims about research. We've unpacked 4 sciences that inform literacy, policy, and practice, and we've thought about how to talk about evidence. So now we'll transition to how we use evidence to make decisions. By getting a deeper understanding of ESSA's levels of evidence, we'll see how they exist in service of every practitioner being able to take the same approach and use the same criteria. As practitioners, you're not expected to do exactly what psychometricians do because your setting might be different in a variety of ways. But you can bench the evidence generated as one piece of a puzzle in your decision making. With that, I will hand it over to Corey to help us think about how to use those ESSA levels of evidence.
Great, thanks, Christina. I want to highlight some of the comments and thoughts that I'm seeing here within the Padlet. I saw one under some of the challenges about understanding what evidence means, and that's a great tee up to the rest of our webinar today, in which we're really going to take quite a bit of time to help illuminate what is evidence and what all goes into something having a strong level of evidence. So the Every Student Succeeds Act, passed in 2015, is the latest authorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which originated back in 1965. Each iteration of ESEA has contributed something unique to U.S. education. One of ESSA's hallmarks is its focus on the use of evidence-based interventions. It lays out a taxonomy that defines 4 tiers of evidence, as Christina shared briefly earlier, and sets expectations for certain programs or funding to use programs or practices that meet a minimum level of requirements. And this changes slightly across programs or across funding opportunities. But you see the language that comes directly from that legislation, from ESSA back in 2015, there on the right-hand side of the screen. These 4 tiers, sometimes just referred to by their labels of tier 1, 2, 3, or 4, classifies evidence as either strong, moderate, or promising, or as demonstrating a rationale. And so in this section of our presentation, we're really going to dive in to see what's the difference among these various tiers and what goes into making determinations for those 4 tiers. The information we're presenting comes from 3 primary sources. The first, of course, is the ESSA language that we just looked at on the previous slide. A second source of information is non-regulatory guidance that's been put out by the U.S. Department of Education to support understanding and use of the tiers defined in legislation. Originally published shortly after ESSA in 2015, this guidance was recently revised in 2013. The guidance presents information, this non-regulatory guidance document, put in chat there for you, presents information in 2 sections. First, it reviews steps for decision-making about evidence use and evidence building. And then it reviews the criteria for identifying the strength of evidence that supports evidence-based project components. For those familiar with the original, and maybe hearing for the first time, there's an update. Some changes in this revised guidance include confirming the applicability of continuous improvement and the evidence definitions even beyond ESSA. It also updates the guidance to reflect the most current evidence provisions in EDGAR, the Education Department General Administrative Regulations that govern some grants, ESSA implementation, and so on. So the third source that informs today's summary, our walkthrough of evidence, is the What Works Clearinghouse Standards Handbook. Along with the WWC Procedures Handbook, these technical manuals lay out processes used by the What Works Clearinghouse. The What Works Clearinghouse is an online resource published by the Institute for Education Sciences, a branch of the U.S. Department of Education. The What Works Clearinghouse conducts both systematic reviews and single study reviews of available evidence using a 5-step process laid out through these two handbooks. Today, we're hoping to provide deeper understanding of the criteria used to review those studies as defined in the Standards Handbook. So on this slide, I'm summarizing the criteria defined by those review standards. We'll look in a moment at how these are used to classify studies among the tiers. This is a topic summary and not reflective of any particular process, just to get us to begin thinking about these criteria before we look at how they get applied. Broadly speaking, the strength of evidence is informed by the purpose and outcomes of the study. That is, the rationale and the documented effects that a study finds. The design type, as Christina discussed earlier in the session, and the quality of the design and its execution also come into play. Finally, it considers the participant characteristics, including sample size, setting, site diversity, and the population studied. So let's look at how these criteria are used to classify the strength of evidence into the 4 ESSA tiers. To do so, we're going to be unpacking a tool that we've designed to help you understand these criteria and how they're applied when determining the ESSA tier of evidence for a program or practice. It is a decision tree, meaning that by answering the questions and following the paths, it will guide you to a decision for which tier of evidence is appropriate, or if in fact the evidence fails to qualify for any of these tiers, which some do. If we read down the boxes at the left-hand side, we see the happy path of all criteria that would lead to the highest evidence rating, which is a tier 1 strong evidence. I encourage you to have the tree open or handy as we walk and talk through it here today. The link has been put into chat for you to download a version of this decision tree. I want to point out that throughout the tree, each box is numbered. Those are the blue boxes in the upper left-hand side of each box, and I'll be referring to those as we walk systematically through and utilize this tree to understand some of the broad characteristics that go into this. But before we start, I want you to keep a couple of things in mind. First, the strength of a program or practice is determined at the outcome level. What I mean by that is that the same program may have strong evidence for one outcome, such as oral reading fluency, but not present positive outcomes and therefore evidence in another outcome, such as comprehension. And so we can conduct this analysis of studies that meet the core criteria to come to different findings of the level of evidence in different areas, depending upon how this all comes together. The second item to note, just at a high level, is that strong evidence designation doesn't necessarily mean that the strategy is better than others. It may mean that other strategies have not been studied using rigorous methods, may not have been studied at all, or simply have not yielded positive or negative outcomes significant enough to say that the strategy being studied is likely to have caused the desired outcomes, thus warranting more study. And as we'll see in our wrap up, as we try and contextualize evidence in the many other things that go into determining whether a particular program, practice, or intervention is appropriate for your setting, there are other factors like readiness and funding and staffing and all the other things that go into what it takes to implement a practice that goes into the wider decision making just beyond the evidence. All right, so there is a second handout that we've developed as well, getting back to that great question about how can we share this with others. This second handout is really a professional learning tool. This placemat defines key terms that are used within the questions of the decision tree. And within training or coaching, you could print the decision tree and the placemat back to back as one easy reference for educators or educational leaders as they consider evidence and really unpack this information back in your own context. All right, last piece, and then we're going to dive into the decision tree. Before we start down that yellow brick road, let me orient you to the colors and icons that you're going to see on the following slides as we walk through it. So we'll be unpacking the tree one question box at a time. For each box, the one or two questions must be answered yes to follow the yes path. If either of the two questions is a no, you'll follow the no path. I've used a stoplight colors throughout the upcoming slides to just help us orient us to the traffic pattern here. If you answer no, and this leads to a decision, then the box will be red. If you answer no, but the path continues, it'll be yellow. And finally, if we answer yes, the box is green, and we'll either continue down the path to the next box as specified, or you may have arrived at a decision. The ultimate decisions themselves are indicated on the slides by an icon, either a check or a stop sign. A check indicates a final decision, right? We've determined if it's levels 1, 2, 3, or 4. A stop sign also indicates a final decision, but in this case, the determination is that the program or practice does not meet the criteria for any of the ESSA tiers of evidence. We can stop there. All right, so let's begin. So the first question that begins this entire process in box 1, right at the top of our decision process, is does at least one well-designed and well-executed study of this practice or program use an experimental, quasi-experimental, or correlational design? As Christina pointed out earlier, these are not the only kinds of studies. However, these are the study types that meet the rigorous requirements of ESSA tiers. We'll briefly discuss each type as they appear further on down the tree, but for now I want to highlight the qualifier named here that the study or studies must be well-designed and well-executed. For this purpose, that means that it applies appropriate and rigorous research methods and criteria appropriate to that particular study type. If you recall, our mention of methodology is one of those important tracks of research that contributes to our understanding. Our current understanding of best practices for educational research are documented in process and standards guides like the WWC manual that I mentioned earlier. So a study or multi-study analysis should be conducted by a certified reviewer trained on applying that particular set of standards. Ultimately, that's the purpose of the WhatWorks Clearinghouse, is to have well-trained and certified folks do that technical work to some extent for us, right? If the answer is yes to that first question, we proceed to box 2. We have a study that followed the core methodology to be considered well-designed and well-executed. However, if the answer is no to this question, we'll move to box 2B to see if it meets the criteria as being a promising practice. Let's follow the yes path first. The second box asks, are there statistically significant positive outcomes? Let's start with understanding the meaning of statistically significant. In layperson's terms, this means that the data through statistical analysis indicates that there's a reasonable chance that the activity studied led to, that is, caused the outcomes that they found, right? That is it more likely than chance? If we answer yes, that the study reports out statistically significant positive results, then we move to box 3. If we answer no, that does not necessarily mean that the program is bad or without merit, just that there is currently no evidence to substantiate those benefits. So again, we move to box 2B to ask, can it qualify as a promising practice? So let's unpack promising practices. In box 2B, it determines whether that program or practice qualifies for ESSA Tier 4, demonstrates a rationale. To do so, we have to meet 2 conditions. First, there must be a well-specified logic model for the practice or program based on supporting research. The logic model is a visual that specifies the resources required, the activities or critical components, the outputs, and the anticipated outcome of the program or practice. In addition to having a rationale for why you believe the activity is likely to have the positive outcomes given those defined inputs, ESSA also requires that there be a current or upcoming study underway to generate a study of its effectiveness, whether it's being conducted through a third party or being conducted locally. These 2 criteria taken together form the rationale for its use and thus qualify for level 4 of demonstrating a rationale. If we can't define a logic model based on some existing research or we don't have the ability to study it, and by study that can be action research locally to say we have an intention to gather information to determine whether or not this thing we think is going to do good is actually doing good for students, then it doesn't qualify for any of the ESSA tiers. All right, let's move on to box 3. Continuing in the same vein, asking whether there are statistically significant negative effects. If a study has indicated that the program or practice has been found to have negative impact on student learning, this disqualifies the item under study for qualifying under any of the ESSA tiers. So if we answer no, once again, that's our stop sign. It's not qualifying, as obviously we don't want to employ anything that's been shown to have negative impact on students. If we can answer yes, that there are no likely negative effects from the program or practice, then we continue down our happy path to the next criteria. Moving on to box 4, as a reminder, we found one or more well-designed and well-executed study. We determined that there are statistically significant positive effects that were found and that there weren't any statistically significant negative effects. Now we examine the sample size and sites covered by the study or studies. The more participants who have participated in the study, the higher the confidence that we can have in the results. The threshold set by the What Works Clearinghouse standards is that across all qualifying studies, that at least 350 participants are included at a minimum to be considered a large sample size. In addition to a reasonable sample size, confidence in a program or practice's effectiveness also increases when it's been shown to be effective across multiple sites. A site in this case is defined pretty broadly. For examples, this could be across multiple states, multiple counties, multiple cities, multiple school districts, across multiple schools, or perhaps post-secondary campuses. So keeping in mind that both answers must be true in order to follow the yes path, if we've said yes to both of these questions, there's a significant sample size of 350 or more across one or multiple studies, and it's been studied across multiple sites, then we continue down the path to box 5. If we answer no to either question, then we've arrived at the outcome of this program or practice qualifying under Tier 3 as a promising practice. In order to move from promising practice to a higher level of study, we simply need to do additional study with additional students and/or in multiple sites to have confidence in the generalizability of that particular work, right? So that's our first landing within our decision tree in qualifying for one of the tiers of evidence beyond a rationale. If the well-designed and well-executed study or studies have shown those positive effects without negative effects and met the thresholds for for large sample size and multiple sites, then locally you would consider the match between study setting and population to your own. Okay, that's a theoretical match that says with a collection of students, they have found positive results among a fairly large number of students across studies. However, and here's where we go next, that doesn't mean that those students studied will match to your student population or setting. And so that's our next question. Let's define these. So the population that is population as a term refers to the targeted student group to receive the activity. This could be all students. It could be student groups by socioeconomic status, could be by English learner status or special education status, could be by race, ethnicity, gender, or other groups. For example, if a study was conducted in districts with a student population that is 85% white, but you teach in a district in which 70% of your students are Black, Indigenous, or other people of color, or the sample study was conducted with all students, but you're seeking a practice specifically to use with students with disabilities, obviously we cannot make assumptions that the findings provide evidence that that activity will prove effective for our targeted student population. The same goes for settings. Settings considers factors such as urbanicity, school size, or school model. The great thing about the What-Works Clearinghouse is it does the hard methodological work and the technical work of determining if it meets study type methodology criterion. But what it can't do, it gets to a point where it identifies a potential tier of evidence. And then locally, we have to determine whether or not those studies match our particular setting to be able to justify that level, or perhaps knock it down a peg because it doesn't provide confidence that it'll work for us, right? So if the study has a reasonable match to both your population and setting, we'll move on down the road to box 6. If not, we move over to box 5B. In 5B, it asks whether the study matches either your population or your setting. So if it doesn't match either, then we've determined that the program or practice qualifies for Tier 3 and is only a promising practice. But if one or two conditions match, either match our population or our setting, then we move on to box 6B. All right. Everybody with me? We're getting towards the bottom here. So moving on to box 6. If we're in box 6, that means that we were able to answer yes to all of the previous criteria along the left-hand side. The last hurdle to Tier 1 strong evidence rating is whether the study design is that gold standard, a well-executed experimental design, also commonly called a randomized controlled trial or RCT. In an experimental design, a study compares outcomes between two groups of individuals who are equivalent except for their random assignment to either the treatment group receiving the project component under study or a control group that does not. If the evidence does not come from an experimental design study, then we move to our final box, box 6B. But if it does, we have gotten through all of the criteria to qualify and determined that it qualifies under ESSA Tier 1 for strong evidence. All right, let's look at the last box here. The last box differentiates between Tiers 2 and 3. If the study or studies only matched one of the population or setting, or it was not experimental, then it was a quasi-experimental or correlational design because we got through question 1. And if the studies were quasi-experimental, that means that the design attempts to approximate an experimental design by identifying similar control and treatment groups, but without random assignment, then the evidence meets ESSA Tier 2 for moderate evidence. If we answer no to this question, then the study used was correlational as a design, and the evidence falls under ESSA Tier 3, promising evidence. Right? So a correlational design uses analytical methods to account for differences, but doesn't start attempting to have equivalent groups per se. All right. So as you can see, let's bring it all together. There's a lot that goes into determining whether a program or practice has evidence of positive outcomes to inform adoption within local districts and schools. National clearinghouses like the What Works Clearinghouse, of which there are several, do the heavy lifting for educators. Certified reviewers apply the criterion from ESSA and the non-regulatory guidance, as well as identified methodological standards to evaluate the study quality to determine the highest potential ESSA tier of evidence. It's only the potential tier because they can't evaluate the match between that study's population and settings. We have to do that locally. So if your population or setting don't overlap with the study sample, it will result in a lower tier for you than is being demonstrated on the site as the highest potential tier, as it doesn't align with your community yet under the current evidence. While this deep dive into criteria for strong evidence was likely review for some of you on this webinar, we developed and share these resources to make an important distinction among research, evidence, and claims about research. Any completed study falls under the category of research. However, as we've seen, not all research studies contribute to the body of evidence that supports the likely benefit of the program or practice that's being studied. Poor study design, poor execution, small sample sizes, single sites, or certainly negative findings all can prevent a study from being appropriately used to support use of a program or practice. In plain terms, just because there's a study doesn't mean there's supporting evidence. So to come back to our analogy introduced earlier by Christina, this is an umbrella. This is also an umbrella, but it won't keep you dry. It's not accomplishing the core purpose of an umbrella, right? So the same is true of some research. It's research, but it may not successfully contribute to the evidence base in support of a program or practice. Now, it's important to note that's okay. If well designed, surely we learned something from the effort. In fact, that's how science works. We identify a hypothesis and we try to prove it false. And sometimes we do. If we fail to prove it false, then we're left with an idea that maybe that's true. Finally, there's one more problem. In addition to research and evidence, there are also claims about research. It's not uncommon for us to see research either misrepresented, misunderstood, or misapplied, right? So these distinctions can be important once again, as we're having discussions about evidence in support of policies or in support of practices or programs. So what's the point? Here are a few takeaways we hope can help you engage in the critical discourse taking place around literacy across the country in ways that are productive and apply evidence appropriately in support of literacy policies and practices. So first, when you are supporting claims, policies, or programs and practices, be sure to cite evidence and not just research. Understand if they've met some of these criteria and in fact are supportive of the thing you're advocating for and not just having had studied it. And when discussing evidence, be clear about identifying for whom and in what context there is evidence to support its use. If a study found evidence in a context that doesn't reflect your own, it may not be particularly supportive for the local decision making that you're engaged in, or for a policy decision that may be up for debate. And finally, keep in mind that not everything's been studied, and innovation is a hallmark of any profession. However, when using a promising practice, be sure that you clearly identify the logic model based on supporting evidence, and then study its effects. Don't assume that it's beneficial just because the logic model suggests that it should be. Study over time to see that it's getting the results that you hoped for when you decided to implement. So before we pause and stop and take additional thoughts and reflections, let's ground this entire discussion of evidence a little more broadly into the larger context of decision-making around literacy. Earlier, we mentioned that there are lots of decisions that we make in education using data and evidence. some of which are on the screen here. While vital to our data-based decision-making in education, quantifiable data cannot be the only source of our decisions, right? So first of all, not everything is quantifiable. Second, there are so many other important factors. To highlight this, I want to use two resources just as an example. These are two examples of many such resources to support identification and selection of a program, practice, or intervention for a local district or school. So, evidence is one piece of the puzzle. What are some of the other pieces? One example, the National Implementation Research Network has produced a tool they call the Hexagon tool, designed as a planning tool to guide selection and evaluation of potential programs and practices. It highlights 6 areas for consideration in 2 different categories. We see that evidence is one of the criteria to be explored under its program indicators alongside usability and available supports. Other site-based factors include your capacity to implement the program or practice, its fit with your current initiatives, and the extent to which it meets the needs that are being addressed. Ideally, when we go searching for solutions, we've clearly defined root causes and defined the problem we're seeking a solution for. So even if a program or practice has a strong evidence base, that doesn't mean it'll be a good fit or will be able to be implemented with fidelity as intended locally with success. Right? Evidence is maybe a starting point or a starting criteria, but there's more involved. One more example, the National Center on Intensive Intervention provides the taxonomy of intervention intensity for academics. It's designed to support educators in evaluating and building intervention intensity as part of an MTSS and in support of students. Here we see that the dimension of strength, which is their term for the documented effect size of the program, is one criteria that can be examined when considering the intensity of the intervention. Right? If we find an intervention's not working or being as successful as we hope, perhaps we need to examine that evidence in comparison to the population we're using the program with. However, dosage, alignment to a student's identified needs, attention to transfer from intervention more broadly into the classroom and home and elsewhere, comprehensiveness or the explicitness of instruction, the integrated supports that are available, and individualization are all additional important factors that contribute to the intensity of instruction and affect the effectiveness and efficiency of an intervention. So we see here that there's a lot that goes in, as we know, into decisions, and evidence can play one really helpful role in ensuring that the solutions that we're identifying to implement have an evidence base that suggests it's likely to have the outcomes that we want if we consider it more holistically within a larger context of, is it able to be implemented within our context? And or does it match our setting and student population? Or do we need to be careful and do study to ensure that the positive effects found in the study also appear for us in our own setting? So as we close, let's review where we've been. Within the current policy and practice debates over literacy instruction, including discussion of the science of reading, we've witnessed evidence being tossed about casually at times, recklessly at others. Many of us have also witnessed reference to evidence conflated to suggest there is clear and settled evidence to support claims and policies far and wide. But we hope this exploration has defined and distinguished in important ways the sciences, or at least the tracks of scientific study that inform literacy policy and practice, the criteria and the decision-making processes that go into defining evidence as differentiated from just mere research, and to provide some frames to support productive discussion with colleagues, friends, family, and community. You've also received a couple of resources to support your learning and to share with others, including the recently revised non-regulatory guidance, a decision tree for determining ESSA tiers of evidence, and a supporting placemat of key terms, and a couple tools that could be used to evaluate or select among potential solutions to identify needs, each of which includes evidence as just one piece of the larger puzzle. All right. With that, we're going to pause here and take a moment to do a little catch up, to take a look at any questions in the Q&A or in the chat. And at this time, I encourage you once again to return to the Padlet and continue to add any thoughts and ideas that connect to your experience, that perhaps have extended your thinking and understanding, or perhaps are challenging you as you think about application within your own work and your own settings. As I'm catching up on our internal chat, I see that I misspoke in one spot about the update on the non-regulatory guidance. I said 2013, when in fact it was just last year in 2023. Thanks, Christina, for checking there. There is one clarifying comment that I very much appreciate and would like to call out in the Q&A. Somebody mentioned that the IRB, the review boards that approve scientific studies, do allow studies to compare a program by providing instructional programs to a student, and withholding instruction for a short period of time, so long as they do receive that intervention or that particular experience after the study. Yes, thank you for sharing that. It is true that can happen. In the example that we utilized of repeated reading, we know that automaticity builds over an extended period of time. And that period of time may take weeks, if not for some students or students with disabilities, months to engage, which makes it trickier to get that kind of approval and to do that kind of study for an extended period. But I appreciate that comment. Christina, anything you want to add here as we take a look at comments or reflect on today's session?
I encourage you, as we are getting towards the end of our time together, we do have some time to have a bit more conversation. So continue to put questions into the chat or the Q&A, or to add some more content to the Padlet. But otherwise, we really thank you for joining us. We know that this is especially a busy time of year for school districts and for universities, and we appreciate you making the time and the space to think about this with us. We have our contact information up on the screen right now. And we also have a survey that we would love to get your input and feedback on the content of this webinar, the infographics that we've shared with you, the other resources, and to think about how the center can support your needs and build capacity for you to do the work that you do with teachers and with students.